Great. Thank you all for coming to this. I'm going to do a very brief intro as to how we got to wherever we are today. Definitely one of the questions I want to ask you all, which is where exactly are we today on US-China tech and the US-China relationship. But brief overview, and I'm going to have you all introduce yourself, and then we'll just dive into the conversation. So the US-China relationship in its modern form started with a desire to balance against the Soviet Union. 1989, Tiananmen Square massacre, soon after the crumbling of the Soviet Union, and there needed to be a new justification for the relationship. In the 90s, it was mostly about economic development and also about bringing political liberalization to the Chinese people. Very widespread idea in the 90s was that China would democratize and just sort of pushing on an open door, and that sooner or later Chinese people would taste the freedom of the American system. Obviously, a lot more complicated than that. 2001, you had Bush come in, starting to push for a tougher view on China. Then 9/11 happened, and the relationship was defined mostly by a partnership with terrorism. That went on until roughly 2005. It's this famous Wither China speech. I think were you in government then, Bob?
Yes.
And the question of how to make China a responsible stakeholder, how to bring them into the global system. And that was basically the framework until roughly 2016. And one of the things that the election of Trump caused to shift, to put it politely, in the global thinking is how do we deal with Beijing when there's no longer this belief that they will become a responsible stakeholder in the system that the US mostly built. So we're sort of trying to figure out why the relationship is, what do we want from it, and how much trust US companies can have when they invest in China, especially in regions like Xinjiang, where, as you know, there's hundreds of thousands, if not upwards of 1 million Muslims in concentration camps. So let's have everyone very briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into questions. So let's go name and tell me a little bit about your company and what you do.
Absolutely. I'm Jonathan Ward. I'm the founder of Atlas Organization, which is a consultancy for American businesses on navigating US-China global competition. I'm also the author of a new book on CCP, sort of Chinese Communist Party global grand strategy called China's Vision of Victory. I did my PhD at Oxford in China-India relations.
Thank you. Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF. We're a think tank in Washington. And we've been focused on this challenge from China for many, many years. We wrote a report back in 2010 with the provocative title of Enough is Enough, Confronting Chinese Innovation Mercantilism. I also had the pleasure of spending time with Bob.
Many times.
Many times. I was honored to be co-chair of the U.S.-China Innovation Experts Group in the Obama administration, and we were over in Beijing and here in Washington many times on different delegations and interactions with our Chinese counterparts.
Thanks. I'm Bob Hormats. I am currently Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates. Prior to that, was Undersecretary of State for Economic, Energy, and Environmental Affairs. And early on in my career, in the very early 1970s, I worked as Henry Kissinger's economic advisor when we started opening up with China, and have visited there during that period and very frequently thereafter.
Yeah, you've been watching this from the beginning. So tell us a
Yes.
little bit about what Kissinger Associates does.
Kissinger Associates essentially provides advice to businesses, American businesses and businesses in other parts of the world on their international activities in China, but not just in China, and in various other parts of the world. But there's, as you can imagine, a fairly substantial amount of focus on China, because it's the fastest growing economy in the world, it's the second biggest economy in the world, and there are a lot of American companies engaged in trade and investment and trying to figure out how to navigate through opportunities and take advantage of opportunities, but also deal with various issues that arise from time to time.
Fantastic. So, Jonathan, let's start with you. When we're talking about where we are today in the US-China tech relationship, I personally hate the phrase New Cold War, and I hate the phrase tough on China, but it's hard to think of how to describe this particular period we're in? Do you have a catchy way of thinking about it?
Sure, and I think you're right. It hasn't been named yet. I mean, we're still waiting for the name of this major historic moment where the U.S. and China are going to be in a contest, and it's going to be a long-term contest. It's a contest over essentially economic preeminence, military preeminence, technology, and also values and ideology. So, in many ways, it does have certain reminiscences of the Cold War and of other significant periods in U.S. competition with outside powers, particularly authoritarian powers. But bottom line, where I think we are and where I hope we are is at the beginning of a national awakening on this subject. And I think that's been brought in by the recent administration and also in a bipartisan way. The other thing is, we speak here just within the same month in which the NBA has sort of found itself in its own sort of situation with the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party. And I think that's brought it to a popular place for the first time, which, experts and academics and scholars and practitioners can talk about the South China Sea, we can talk about the concentration camps in Xinjiang, we can talk about all sorts of geopolitical aspects of the Belt and Road in a million different forums, but that doesn't really get the message across to the American public, which I think at the end of the day is the decisive sort of prime mover in how the US gets ready to compete with something this big and something that's going to be this hard.
What do you think, Robert?
No, I agree with that. I think what's different today, as my colleague Mike Lind has written, is in the old Cold War, we faced a robust competitor for military and global dominance in the Soviet Union, but they weren't really an economic competitor. We faced a very tough economic competitor in Japan and to some extent Germany. This is the first time really in our history we've ever had them combined together. We have a competitor for global dominance or global hegemony, but also we have an incredibly robust technology competitor. We wrote a report at ITIF probably 5 months ago or so, where we looked at China on about 25 different indicators of innovation-based progress, and just did a graph that said, here's where they were in 2007 compared to us, X percent, and here's where they are in 2017. And on every single one, they've made dramatic progress. And I think people tend to still have a little bit like when a black hole or star explodes, we don't see it. The light hasn't come to us yet, and I think that's true in China. They're farther along than I think a lot of Americans think. And at the same time, we're kind of going in the wrong direction. And this last point I'll make is a report we released yesterday where we looked at the top 35 countries in the world in terms of funding university research by government. So money to Columbia here or Caltech or whatever. And the United States ranks 28th on a per GDP basis. So we're disinvesting, and they're doing the opposite. And people, Jonathan's work and others are beginning to realize that this is a problem.
What do you think, Bob?
I think you put it better than I could have. One of the things that you emphasized that we have really missed out in even beginning to understand is how competitive they are and how rapidly they have become as competitive as they are now, and how we, with all the complaints we make about China, and you hear them all the time, and the narrative in this country is complaining, criticizing. The remarkable thing is that there's so little in the way of a domestic narrative about how we should improve our competitiveness. If we regard them as such an important competitive challenge, then we should be doing exactly the reverse of what we're doing now. We're now, let's say, take the 1950s, where we needed to catch up to the technology developments that we saw, not just in the Soviet Union, but in Germany and Japan and elsewhere. We brought in the best and the brightest from around the world. We put more money into STEM research, supporting our universities. We put more money into the National Science Foundation and various other groups that do basic research. There was a strong national support among the American people for becoming more competitive. What do we do now? We have restrictions on immigration, and the best and the brightest get caught up in those restrictions. NSF has been cut dramatically. The national labs have been cut dramatically. STEM research compared to many other countries is faltering. The Chinese have far more grads and post-grads in that area than we do. And if you look, I was in China, I go to China as we all do quite frequently, and you listen to the speeches, and I was at an event with President Xi and various others, Wang Qishan, Prime Minister, all of them, and various others at other levels. Innovation, catching up, AI, quantum computing, 5G. This is a national narrative, and the country's behind it. If you watch the debates and you listen to presidential speeches and you listen to other speeches in Washington, that narrative is almost nowhere to be heard. I counted in the Democratic debate, and this was more than most. There were two of the candidates who actually spent more than 2 minutes on innovation, technology, how do we become more competitive? 2. And how many times has the president given a speech on innovation, competitiveness? Look at the budgets. Almost nothing. So what I regard this is really a lot of complaints and a lot of concerns about China, but if we're really focusing on this, we should have a national competitiveness strategy, or at least a narrative. We have neither.
I think one thing it's great that we are getting is we're starting to debate these issues publicly. I have a follow-up question, but Robert, you wanted to dive
Yeah, I was just going to, just to Bob's point, which, we're in violent agreement on. There's a blog, I think we're posting it tomorrow or I don't know, sometime this week, so I encourage you to just go to itif.org and you can read it. But what we did is we looked at how much government subsidies of business R&D in China versus the US, how much venture capital, and how much of the R&D tax credit. 95% of Chinese companies that are in industry, 95% get government subsidized R&D, and it accounts to 22% of their R&D. That number is 6% in the US, and most of that is it's defense companies.
Yeah, sure.
R&D tax credit, if we wanted to have the same level of R&D tax credit, ours would have to go from 14% to 42%. And venture capital, the amount of money the government alone puts in venture capital, which I'm not advocating for government venture capital, but just to put it in perspective, is twice as much as we put in our private venture capital in the US. So people, eventually that stuff matters.
Yeah, can I just add and underscore Rob's point? The notion is people say, I did a blog for The Hill on very much the same thing, on why we're not putting more money into competitiveness, and I used the government just because I was had to be short. And I got these responses, well, the government doesn't need to put any money because the private sector is doing it all. And then I came back and said, well, the government R&D is very different. It's very basic, very early stage research. Corporations really don't do that. And second, the corporate numbers aren't that great either. So, so we're dismissing this thing with a wave of a hand, and there's no national narrative to speak of. Very different. When I watched Sputnik as a kid, there was Eisenhower, the infrastructure. Eisenhower said, we need more infrastructure. We need more STEM. He took the lead in doing that. Infrastructure, just walk around. You can see that. Look at China's infrastructure. They move things around, and it's not just roads. It's a telecommunication system where they, have put up a lot of infrastructure.
I think one of the things that points to the difficulty we find ourselves in right now is that the situation with China is in many ways much more complicated than the Soviet Union. It's much harder to say that Beijing is the enemy. I mean, we're comparing it to Sputnik. And Bob, I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether or not you feel like the US can work with a Communist Party-led China. If we're making the Sputnik comparison, is the Communist Party the problem here? What do you think?
Oh, well, you're asking someone who's worked with China since the early 70s. So I'm of the view that we can, and I'm also of the view that there are a number of areas, there's certainly a number of differences, and I don't want to dismiss that at all, and I'm sure they'll come out, and difference of systemic differences, policy differences, structural differences, they exist for sure. But I'll just pick one or two areas that are of interest, and we can elaborate on those. One, intellectual property. The Chinese, I gave a keynote speech at the Shenzhen High Tech Fair, and met with a lot of these innovators. They have a strong interest in protection of intellectual property too, because now they have their own. They're developing a lot of IP, AI, and in particular in 5G, quantum computing. So there are strong constituencies in China for greater degree of protection of intellectual property. Second, they do want, and we're seeing it now in this new investment law. We haven't seen all the details in the regs, but their new investment law, by the accounts of American companies, is a lot better than the past. So there are certainly areas of convergence that you can build on, and I believe there are. It's, and you have to compete and find ways of making changes where they're needed, but where there are areas of convergence, we ought to be building on those. That's really the history of the relationship. It's changed a lot since over the last 10 years. It's not the sort of the easy type of cooperation of a few decades ago, much more complicated, as everyone's pointed out, but I think there's still areas of convergence.
Jonathan, did you want to jump in there?
Well, I think it's also important to understand essentially how China got to the place that it did, which is, of course, the grand-scale theft of American intellectual property and the forced joint ventures and the continued sort of cyber and human espionage campaign that goes on against not only the United States government, but against pretty much every American firm. I mean, is that kind of where we are? I think that there's an element to also working to protect the advantages that we do have. I mean, one thing that happened in the Cold War was, of course, you could genuinely say it's a competition between two systems. Whereas today, it's kind of a competition between our system and their system when their system has access to our R&D. So this is something that I think we're going to have to improve. And I also think that this fundamentally is going to wind up, the only way to change the long-term dynamics of the US-China contest is to start winning the economic competition. And that means, in my view, a competition for absolute GDP and for essentially the health and strength of our Fortune 1000 and our corporates, who are now going to have corporate competitors coming out of China as national champions based on that stolen R&D. So wherever they might be on IP and whatever law might mean in China, I mean, remember, Hu Jintao, head of the Supreme People's Court, saying, of course, that the party comes first, then the people, then the law. So, there are intelligence laws that say every Chinese entity must participate in national intelligence collection. I mean, all of these issues that we're going to be dealing with, not only in what they call the period of strategic opportunity, which is getting to this point where they have this advantage vis-a-vis the United States, but also in this more contested environment, and we're going to have to deal with all of that. So I think we are going to have to find ways to be protecting our IP, while at the same time increasing our innovative power. And then, that's really where the competition begins, with that level of awareness and capability on our side.
So, question about where things are in China, and for any of the panelists, do you feel like the success of Chinese tech companies like Alibaba, like Baidu, happened because of the Communist Party or despite the Communist Party?
I don't think there's any question it happened because of the Communist Party. Baidu would not, they might still be around, but they wouldn't be a very strong company if they hadn't essentially taken what Google did and forced Google out. Google was actually doing quite well in China before Baidu, before they got kicked out. And the Chinese had a clear strategy, which was we're going to copy every single major internet platform technology and business model. We're going to copy it into our companies, and we're going to protect them from the American competitors. Well, when you have somebody protecting you from competition, it's a lot easier to gain market share. So I don't think those companies, they're still, and now they've become more innovative in their own right, I get that, but I don't think they'd be anywhere near what they are if it hadn't been for government policy and protection.
Bob, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think the government's certainly been very supportive of Chinese companies in a wide range of areas. I think if we're looking to the future, with the momentum they've got and this very large internal market, particularly for data and information, which is really the fruit of AI, they're now on a path toward a lot more domestic-led innovation, and probably don't need the foreign innovation as much going forward. So the question is, can we find in the next 10 years an environment in which we can work together to create a framework where this innovative competition and where the competition for global markets takes place within some framework that avoids conflict. I think the notion that comes out, this decoupling notion that you hear, or containment or suppressing Chinese technological growth, I think these are all, A, impossible to do, even if we wanted to do them, and second, that is not a rational American strategy to begin with, because the world's too integrated now. And you have Chinese scientists and American scientists working. I was just up at Johns Hopkins, working on advanced stage medical cures. And in China, a lot of American foreign scientists working on various other things. So the world's too integrated. So we're going to have to find a way of figuring out how to work together over the next 10 years with two different systems and very different sets of rules, and a very different set of ideas of how the global system ought to be organized. This is a difficult challenge. The president says, well, phase one was what's been agreed the last, or we think has been agreed, we don't quite know. But phase 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this is a multi-decade process of working these issues out in the collective, cooperative way.
Speaking of integration, there's a very important policy in China called civil-military fusion, also translated as civil-military integration, and the two are related, which essentially says that all of the innovation which comes out of China's private sector has to be brought to the Chinese military, if helpful. So I think when we think about the level and the nature of collaboration, and there may be some things that can be set aside, but there are also a whole lot of things where you really have to start asking the question. I think Congress is starting to do this in some of the acts that they're proposing, of where are our companies in their level of engagement with China, and how's that getting fed back into the Chinese military? Because you also have a Chinese military that is, essentially designed to fight the United States and our allies in the Pacific. And you have a Chinese leadership which on a regular basis at this point calls to fight and win wars. I mean, Xi Jinping also, speaking about Hong Kong recently, was saying that any attempt to split China will result in broken bones and broken bodies. I mean, these sorts of things are the rhetoric coming from the very top of the enterprise, into which all of their own corporates are increasingly linked. I mean, the civil military fusion program, the placement of Communist Party members on the boards of companies. I mean, there's probably an element to, for example, let's say once Jack Ma built Alibaba, the Communist Party probably said, well, thank you, Jack, we'll take it from here. And whereas others, I think, are more authentically, Baidu, for example, working on civil military fusion and machine learning for combat capabilities, and civil, or rather that's more at Tsinghua, but Baidu working on command and control with the Chinese military. I mean, all of these things. And the other side to it, of course, is that our corporate giants are going to have to go out and compete in emerging markets versus Chinese corporates that are going around the Belt and Road with the support of the Communist Party and linked to China's grand strategy objectives, whether that's Made in China 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the whole rest of the picture. So I think, again, this is going to be a corporate competition. We have to have our Fortune 1000 sort of ready for this. And at the same time, we are going to have to draw clear lines. I think that's why you have things like the entities list, which just barred a whole bunch of surveillance state. I mean, you're talking about some of China's hottest startups, SenseTime, Megvii, these sorts of things that, yes, they're making, things for the Uyghur surveillance state. And very quickly, Isaac, if you don't mind, I'd like to read something from, it's a thing that just came out from Xinjiang. It's in Hormats. Do you mind if I do something? Okay. This is a woman who sought asylum, a Uyghur woman who sought asylum in Sweden. And she talks about this piece in the concentration camp. She says, the daily routine began at 6 a.m. Chinese instruction took place after a paltry breakfast, followed by repetition and rote learning. There were specified hours for learning propaganda songs and reciting slogans from posters. I love China. Thank you to the Communist Party. I am Chinese. I love Xi Jinping, China's president. The camp's commanders set aside a room for torture, she says, which inmates dubbed the Black Room, because it was forbidden to talk about it explicitly. There were all kinds of tortures there. Some prisoners were hung on the wall and beaten with electrified truncheons. There were prisoners who were made to sit on a chair of nails. I saw people return from that room covered in blood. Some came back without fingernails. They would punish inmates for everything. Anyone who didn't follow the rules was punished. Those who didn't learn Chinese properly or didn't sing the songs were also punished. There's a lot more to that, but you can see why there are congressional hearings right now on Xinjiang and on the role of people are asking, how is forced labor there getting into our supply chains. Where are our companies on this subject? So this is a real thing. It's a real issue.
Bob, what are your thoughts on the camps in Xinjiang?
I have to tell you, that's an area I know nothing about and have.
We just heard that.
I've been there. Well,
Yeah, and I'm sure you've read other things about it too.
yeah, but I think I will stick to my lane, which is economics, and not comment on Xinjiang.
Do you think it's inappropriate for because you advise companies, and I know you don't want to speak specifically about that for client confidentiality, but if you have a company that is looking to invest in Xinjiang.
Yeah, as I just repeat what I said before, I'll stick in my lane and not comment on Xinjiang.
Okay, so one of the
I can comment
things.
on it.
Sure. Let me just finish up with Bob here, and then I'll come back to that. So, one of the differences between the situation with the Soviet Union and the situation with China today, of the many differences, is this idea of elite caption, this idea of conflicts of interest. And Robert, I'm less familiar with you, but I know the three of us here make our money from China and from the views that we have about China. And not from China, but yeah, I mean, you're a China. You talk about these things. It's not about being paid by Beijing or the party, because I don't think Bob does either. It's from American companies or American institutions that work with China. This is our bread and butter. And Bob, I'd love to understand more, because it's something I do a lot of thinking about with my own potential conflicts of interest, obviously at a much lower level and a non-corporate level than you, but with being a journalist, with working at think tanks, and with doing some occasional consulting. What role does your position with Kissinger play in the views that you express publicly about China and about situations in China?
Well, I think it's two things. That clearly, I work for Kissinger, who does have a long history and talks to Chinese leaders on a regular basis. But having been to China and started out in the early stages and spent a lot of my career in the process of trying to strengthen U.S.-China relations and develop opportunities for mutual cooperation between the two countries, it does give me a greater degree, I think, of understanding of what's going on in China, but it also gives me, at least in the way I formulate my thinking, some hope that these issues do not irrevocably lead to a confrontation between the two countries, and then can be worked out. I mean, this is very definitely not the same as the Cold War, in my judgment, having been in government during the Cold War. There are many differences. The Soviet Union was very isolated from the rest of the world economy. China is very integrated. In fact, most of our trading partners trade more with China than they do with us. So this notion of containment or suppression of Chinese growth, as I said, doesn't make sense at all. And the other is, even during the Cold War, we had a lot of conversations with the Soviet Union. We were able to work a lot of things out. So I would say that even if differences do become greater, it does not diminish my hope, indeed my expectation, that over time a lot of differences can be resolved in a constructive way. Maybe some can't, and we're going to have to learn to live with differences, but maybe some can, and those are the ones that I'm at least trying to focus on now, is because the one thing is very clear: if we do have confrontation across the board economically, it's mutually assured disruption for both sides and for the rest of the world. Confrontation between these two integrated economies would be very disruptive for both, and certainly many other countries elsewhere. So we're going to have to figure out some way of dealing with this in a rational way. That's not to say it's easy. It's not to say there are not some very difficult problems, but that's the way I look at it.
Robert, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I read that article too. It seemed, besides being extremely disturbing, it seemed like it was good journalism, but what do I know? But one of the points that came out, though, is should U.S. companies be investing over there? And I think there's a lot of, frankly, in my view, we're missing the grand strategy. The grand strategy should fundamentally be about what is in American interests. And to me, having American companies challenge Chinese companies in all markets around the world, including their home market, is in our interest to do. And you hear that a lot, for example, with Google being criticized. There was an op-ed in the Washington Post today where American Conservative Magazine Institute or whatever. He criticized Google, which was surprising to me because Google actually pulled out of China for human rights reasons. But I guess they're thinking about it. To me, I would love Google to go into China. Anything that takes market share away from the Chinese is in our interest. And I worry, for example, when we're talking about the emerging and foundational technology list around export controls. Absolutely, we don't want to be sharing technology with the Chinese that definitely related to military. But we do want to be selling them advanced technology so we gain market share, we gain revenues, we gain the ability to keep innovating, and they don't. And I think that's the way I would frame all of this. Is it in our interest? And that to me is much more important than anything else, because the big fight, I agree with Jonathan, the big fight is really about economic supremacy and innovation supremacy, and everything we can do to win it, I think we ought to do it.
So there's a strange phenomena with Chinese leaders whereby anyone who served in the Politburo or the Politburo Standing Committee is not allowed to travel overseas after they leave office. And we have the reverse with American officials who are, of course, free to travel, which is great and important. It's a little bit silly that, former Politburo members can't leave, but there's a lot of fears, it seems, inside the system at the top of the party about elite capture and about these people either embarrassing the Communist Party or going over and giving information about private conversations. At the same time, Beijing is probably better than any other major country at showing former American leaders respect and treating them often as if they were still heads of state or if they were still in their government post. And Bob, as the only former government official on here, I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how the way they treat former American officials and that whole piece of it.
I can speak for myself, but I know numerous others who have the same experience, and that is that they very much welcome former American officials, particularly American officials with whom they worked when they were in senior government positions. And when I started out, a lot of the people who are now in the leadership positions of China were in their 20s, like I was, or in their 30s. And as I sort of moved up in my career, I got to know them as individuals, and we've maintained actually personal friendships, but also had very candid conversations. And there's something the Chinese call old friends. Old friends don't necessarily agree with the Chinese, and they don't expect that. What they do like to have in these private, informal conversations is candid views of what people think. And I found one of the things that the Chinese are great learners. They learn, I met years and years ago, several occasions with Deng Xiaoping, who is really one of the great heroes of Chinese innovation. He made a very interesting point. He said, the universities weren't open during the Cultural Revolution, as you may know. And he opened the universities, but he also said Chinese can now travel abroad and go to school abroad, and to the West. They'd go to other places. He said, I want that. I want more Americans to study here. And in a way, it's for the same reasons Rob mentioned, and that is the notion of a discussion of ideas. And American companies, when they come with their ideas about how to do things. And Chinese learn from those, that's true. But it also helps to have debate about ideas, debate about how to do things. With the Chinese, he said, this is not so that China can become like the United States, but it is so that our students can be exposed to the ideas, and we can determine which of those are applicable to China. And he said that is one of the legacies that I'm most proud of, is that I've enabled this to happen, because when these people come back, they'll change China. Not change the Chinese system, but they'll teach, they'll start companies, they'll come up with innovative ideas that build on what was then the platinum standard, which was American innovation. And I think and the Chinese have a similar view when American senior officials come. Former American senior officials, they like to have good conversations and learn what's going on here. They spend a lot of time trying to understand our system. Far more time than we spend trying to understand their system. And I think they're quite good at doing this.
Yeah, no, I agreed. And I spent 6 years in China and fortunately didn't have any of the senior meetings. It'd be fascinating to have a chance to chat with these folks and see how they see things. But I think one of the things that has very much impressed me talking to Chinese people is they're far less sensitive to slights than it comes across when we're here. You know, I've never been in a situation where I've said something about, oh, you know, I don't think the Communist Party should rule China, or, you know, actually I think it's pretty atrocious what's happening in Xinjiang. And it's not like that just shuts off conversation, but people have been able to respond, you know, with sometimes a lot of integrity and just with their views on the subject. I'd be curious, Bob, to get your thoughts on the NBA situation and this debate that it is really sparking about whether or not it's appropriate for Beijing to be policing the speech of Americans and whether it's appropriate for Americans to be able to voice their views on the situation in Hong Kong.
You know, we have very different systems, and we're not going to change each other's systems, and the whole question of what people can say and not say is culturally very different, politically very different, and it's going to take a long time till there's a real convergence on those sets of issues. This is not something that's going to be dealt with or resolved in the near term. This is just we're systemically the way they look at these issues is very different from the way we look at them. That's basically what's happening now.
What do you think, Robert?
Well, as we were saying before the meeting, I think the Chinese, they know more about us, but at another level, they're sort of like teenagers who really don't understand, you know, and so at one level, they thought they could get away with, you know, shutting down the Houston Rocket general manager and threatening this economic boycott. They thought it would work, and it completely blew up in their face. And yeah, I get that there probably won't be any NBA stars talking about Hong Kong anymore, but I think the damage, the awakening that was in America of just how much power the Chinese have over our domestic discourse, and the fact that they wanted to shut down a democratic, movement, I think that really, really hurt them, and I think it's going to continue to hurt them. And I think if they want to win the war, not the cultural propaganda war, they got to get more sophisticated than that. They can't do these kind of ham-handed things. I think it just completely backfired and will continue, in my view.
I also think that there's something important in this moment, which is what Adam Silver was saying, and he had this great. I think he's heroic as of this date. You know, what is it, October 22? We'll see how it all unfolds. But what he said was, first they asked him to fire Daryl Morey, who sent the tweet, and then he said, no, there's no way we're going to do that. We're not even going to reprimand him. But then what he said was, we're an American firm. And these are American values essentially, and they travel with us wherever we go. Among those values is freedom of expression. I mean, what he said in a few sentences. I mean, can you imagine? I think there's no other American company that said something like that in the context of China or really much anything else. I mean, you have this issue today where many companies pride themselves on the last 20, 25 years of free and open globalization under sort of an American unipolar moment and they came to a point where they could call themselves the globally integrated enterprise using global markets, supply chains, all of it. And I think very few in general are willing at this point to call themselves American companies. I mean, that's kind of an issue these days. And here's the NBA saying that, but they're also saying it to a dictatorship that is trying to shut down and succeeding in shutting down the speech of numerous other American corporations. I mean, you also have the examples of Gap, let's say. This is one of my favorites, I think. They had a map on a shirt that was not being printed in China, and the Chinese reacted to this. The Chinese government reacted to this and said, you can't do that. I mean, this shirt was not for sale in China because it didn't include Taiwan and the South China Sea. I mean, these are issues of incredible geopolitical significance, and yet you have China controlling, essentially bringing American and global multinational corporates onto their side of issues where, you know, you have the US Navy out there patrolling, you have the Pentagon essentially rebalancing to deal with the question of Russia and China and these contingencies, you know, one of which is certainly Taiwan and the South China Sea. And our companies are being forced into this, essentially the speech codes of the Chinese Communist Party here at home. Even on things, I mean, this whole thing took place with the NBA over Twitter, which is banned in China. So I just think that there's a really important moment here that's incredibly commendable. I don't know where it's going in the whole picture, but somebody has very bravely stood up and really almost said what would be an honorable thing to say, I think, for any American firm or any firm that's sort of been, you know, come into its greatness through this country, which is, you know, we do have these values, and they are values that we mean to protect as we go out and do business around the world. I think the NBA was uniquely positioned to do something like that based on the leverage in the situation, but still, I think it's extraordinary.
Bob, as the business representative on the panel, what are Kissinger Associates' values?
What are our values? Our values essentially are to try to find ways of working constructively between the clients we have and companies or governments in other countries. And it's to try to work out, you know, the basic process, starting out, as I mentioned, in my own career, I don't look at the world as a zero-sum game. I don't look at relations between China. I don't look at China relations with the U.S. as a zero-sum game. I look at it as an opportunity, as it has been in the past, to try to find areas where there are convergences of interest. There are very different systems in this world. We have to sort of understand, and people who've been in government and elsewhere sort of understand that there are systemic differences, and those systemic differences, we may or may not like the systemic differences, but there is a very strong interest in trying to resolve, at least to the extent possible, differences on systemic or structural issues, and that's really what we're trying to do on a company-by-company basis, because the companies really fit into that framework. I think there's a lot of competition, particularly in the area of advanced 21st century technologies. So the question is, are we going to have a world that is not only disputatious, but a world where these interests conflict to the point of confrontation, which in turn leads to the kind of disruption I was talking about. That, I think, serves no one's interest. Doesn't mean these can be resolved, but it does mean that if you don't resolve them, there are going to be a lot of other disruptive influences that are going to be you know, harmful to various economies, particularly if they're between China and the US, the two biggest economies. They'll be disruptive to both of our economies and to countries that interact with both of us.
So, Bob, you talked before about the presidential debate, and the question for all the panelists. We've unfortunately been in campaign season for quite some time now. I wonder what you think about the Democratic candidates and Trump's policies as it looks to China and the potential tech either competition or decoupling or cooperation, and if there's a particular candidate that you feel like has either a very striking policy or a very positive or negative policy on any of these issues for any of the panelists.
Well, they haven't talked about them that much. Wow. That's part of the problem, one way or the other. I think that the point I try to make in conversations on this issue regarding China is that there are a lot of things that Trump has done, and there are a lot of ways he's done it that I have concerns about in terms of whether they're appropriate or are likely to be effective. Although I must say, I think people like Bob Lighthizer, who's a very good negotiator, and Liu He are actually working pretty well together, and given all that's going on in this environment. But I think there are also Democratic candidates, the notion that somehow all this is going to go away if Trump is out of office. The tone may change, the rhetoric may change, some of the techniques may change, the sort of flipping tariffs on and off may change. But I think there are still going to be a lot of underlying issues that are going to be there. And I think that there are a number of Democratic candidates in the Democratic Party who would be very assertive on some of these issues in much the same way this administration is. It's not, the issues don't change with a new president or a new party in the Senate and the House, but the way of conducting the policy, I think, would change. But there'll still be a lot of strong interest in addressing some of these tough issues.
Any thoughts on that, Robert?
No, I agree with Bob 100% there. There's no going back. Whoever gets elected in 2020 will have to confront these issues and will be tougher than we were, say, 10 years ago, just because the reality is now different, and people are aware of that. My problem with the Democratic candidates is they tend to be in sort of one of three camps, and none of them are the right camp. One is to sort of deny this is an issue and just say, well, we're so much more innovative, we don't have to worry about it. The second is really to focus principally on human rights, which are important, but at the end of the day, if we're focusing on human rights, we're doing it to help China. Maybe in the long game it has some effect on us, but it's not about us in the short run and the medium run, about our economy. And the third is to somehow blame American companies for this problem that we're in, which I really, really object to. American companies do what they do. If all of your clients, Bob, if an American company doesn't do what they do in China, their CEO will be deposed by the shareholders and other people because they haven't done what they're supposed to do. The issue is not what U.S. companies have done or not do. The issue is the playing field and the game that they're engaged in. We've got to change the game. We've got to change the incentives. And I think this sort of reflexively bashing U.S. companies it's irrelevant and it's going down the wrong path. What we do need to do is come up with a stronger grand alliance. And one thing that actually I am encouraged with is that Bob Lighthizer is conducting these trilateral meetings with his counterparts at DG Trade and METI around a new sort of joint trade strategy around China. And I 100% think that's what we should be doing more of.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I want to just jump off what Rob's saying, which is, to me, I think our companies are the answer to this entire picture. I mean, you change the game with China by winning the economic competition. You win the economic competition through our corporations, through the Fortune 1000. I mean, that's how it gets done. So getting them ready, I mean, that's sort of the fleet, I think. It's the U.S. economic fleet that matters. It's 2/3 of our GDP is our corporate. So we've got to be coming up with a strategy that essentially supports them in these hot, contested, difficult global markets where they're going against a $14 trillion state-backed GDP that has a very clear grand strategy. I've laid out the whole grand strategy in China's Vision of Victory, and it's a real thing. And, so how do you get ready to compete and win in that environment? And the other thing, when it comes to candidates and the whole picture right now, I think we have reached a turning point in the United States as to what China means, what the rise of China means, what engagement really resulted in, despite its sort of noblest aspirations. And what we need now is really a vision of the future. And China and China's leaders, the CCP has a very clear vision of the future. And it's the United States that needs to get into that game. I mean, we can come up with an idea of what 2030 looks like, what 2040 looks like, what 2050 looks like. How do we get into the right levels of innovation and R&D, and how do government and corporates get sort of back together in the way that, a lot of our old firms were born through the trials of the Cold War, frankly. That's how it happened. So getting back into a game where our companies are just built to win in global markets, regardless of the Chinese challenge, where they can take that on and absolutely succeed against the Alibabas and the Baidus and the whole rest of the picture. And at the same time, when there really is an alignment of the long-term interests of the United States of America and the U.S. Fortune 1000 and our investment arms. I mean, the other side of this picture, I think, is essentially financial institutions. The big conversation, in my view, in 2020 is going to be what's going to happen to U.S. Capital going into China. We've already seen Chinese FDI into the United States plummet. It dropped 90% since the beginning of this administration. And the question now of how our pension funds and things like that, the stories that are coming out, getting into civil military fusion type programs in China, this is I think, going to be a big issue in 2020, Equitable Act, all of that. Just wanted to say finally that and our companies, I think, are going to have to get better at long-term thinking and better strategic thinking and less of the short-term stuff that I think in the end is really reducing the competitive advantage in a variety of sectors. So in my view, I mean, every Fortune 500 should have essentially an office for long-term strategy in the way that the Pentagon has that at the Office of Net Assessment, for example.
Can I come? I just want to underscore a fundamental point that both my colleagues have made, and that is we're really very divided here internally, about the role of business per se. I mean, this is China, whatever one says about it, they're not divided. There's one can agree or disagree. There's a very strong sense of vision. We're divided. There are those who chastise big business no matter what they do in this country. And there are those who feel big business is really sort of the future of innovation, the future of growth, and growth wouldn't happen without it. So you get this, and no one knows which direction the country is going to move. So if we're so divided internally, it makes it awfully hard for us to deal with these things internationally. And the second point, and I don't see that division within this country. It's a tax issue, it's a social issue, it's a political issue. I don't see a convergence around some common vision of what role corporations should play. And in fact, it could get more intense. But the other point is, no one's quite clear, even in Washington, or especially in Washington, on what our ultimate goal with China is. Is it to have a completely level playing field with the same set of rules and get the Chinese and American companies to play by the same set of rules? Or is it to decouple and to sever ties? And one CEO told me, I'm not sure whether the government's position in Washington, or certain people in Washington's goal is to penalize China or penalize us on, say, the entities list. So this is an interesting question of where, and if you're the Chinese and you think that the goal of the United States is decoupling, then it's awfully hard for Chinese negotiators to get support for more forthcoming positions, because other people in stronger positions say, why give the Americans anything if the ultimate goal is to decouple and suppress us? Why should we make concessions to begin with? So the internal divisions and the divisions about what our future role vis-a-vis China is or should be are really hampering the ability of business to make decisions, because they don't know what the tax laws are going to be. They don't know what the regulatory laws are going to be here, much less what our rules are going to be in terms of what they can do or not do in China.
Robert.
So I agree with that, although I wrote a piece for the National Interest, I think it was the National Interest magazine about a month ago, arguing for market-based decoupling. And what I argued for, Bob, is two things. One is I think we should have much stronger and more open ties with Vietnam, with India. We should pass USMCA. We should send a clear message to our companies. If you want to get out of China, some of it, because there's too much political risk, like Apple just moved their earbuds or something to Vietnam, you're going to have good access to the U.S. market. I think that's number one we should do. And number two.
Does that include TPP?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what I also said. We need a new TPP. Right. So that to me is partly to get some decoupling, but it's not with a hammer. It's more with it's more of a carrot than a stick. Market-based. The second would be to really improve our ability to automate and move towards high productivity production, which would then pull some of the stuff out of China. But the other point I'll make, I'm a little slightly more optimistic than Bob on this point. One of the reasons, Jonathan talked about we need a goal. The goal for most economists, including many I'm sure that are at Columbia, the goal is to allow the market to work. In other words, economists hate goals. The goal is the process. So if you have a goal, you're an interventionist economy who thinks you're smarter than the market. So the goal, the process could be, let the market work and let us specialize in waste paper, oil production, and soybeans. As long as we let the market work, that's a perfectly good outcome. And my colleague Mike Lind and I wrote a piece in the Journal of American Affairs recently where we called it a case for national developmentalism. And what we said is we need to have, like, I'm a Hamiltonian, so not a Jeffersonian, and Hamilton had a goal for the US, and I think that's what we need to do. One last point on that, I look at, historically the Republican Party has been a free market, laissez-faire party, locked in with moral conservatives. And now many Republicans are more national interest, military orientation. And I look at one in particular, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida. And if you haven't seen Senator Rubio's report on China and US competition, it's really worth looking at. Because, Bob, he's really talking about kind of a Republican flavor of an industrial policy or an industrial strategy. And that gives me great hope that the sort of market ideologues are in retreat to some extent and more pragmatic people are getting a little bit more say.
Right. I'd like to comment on that too. I mean, we have to remember what happened to global markets. I mean, it's one thing to have a philosophy of free and open markets and to build that on essentially the American piece. It's another to have, $14 trillion authoritarian enterprise enter into that with all the malpractices it's doing and distort that entirely. I mean, that's really what's gone wrong with global markets, is we've let mercantilism in a massive size with very clear state-driven planning, a massive grand-scale espionage campaign against our firms, and an 800 million person labor force. I mean, all of that's going to be distorted. I mean, we've talked about disruption a little bit. I mean, I think that is the disruption that we're dealing with. And we now have to come to terms with that and be prepared to fight and win economically on this subject. So if we want to preserve, and I think when it comes to goals and grand strategy, I think we have to remember where, how we got here essentially, big picture. I mean, the 20th century was a series of resounding victories for democracies. I mean, we won the Second World War against fascism, we won the Cold War against communist authoritarianism, and then we had this unipolar moment. And after that, we decided that the basic idea was to let the authoritarian nations into this system that we built, that some call the rules-based order, that some call the sort of liberal, order, the Pax Americana, all these things, and then essentially they mounted a takeover. And when you get into all the documents from the party, the Communist Party, and see what they truly want, what their aspirations, strategies, and goals are, you can understand that very clearly. And they believe that they will win. That's the thing, they believe that they will win. So we now, I think, have to go back to what it is to rebuild and reconstitute and strengthen the rules-based order, the free and open democratic world. And if we think about the fact that 2/3 of the global economy is democracies and US allies, I mean, you already have this incredible base from which to build. And despite being a China specialist, I think in many ways we're very distracted by the question of China as a market or the question of China as any of that. I mean, all the opportunity that's possible in the democratic world. I mean, whether it's India, whether it's our allies in Europe or Asia, whether it's the United States itself. I mean, we are the largest economy. We're the $20 trillion economy. We're the largest market. So let's not forget what we have and what we can do, particularly if we can come together with our allies. And I think this, the trade picture that's happening, I mean, sort of, it includes elements of that. If you read the 301 reports, the question of China in the global trading system, I mean, it is, I think, a sort of clear foundation from which to start working with your partners again based on this common problem. And by the time the United States, Europe, Japan all sort of get into the same game, not only on trade, but also on items like export control or investment review, I think you're talking about getting back to the part of where we thought we were when we said to China, despite Tiananmen Square in 1999 or 89, come on in, this will be good for you, it'll be good for everyone.
I think where we are in terms of the debate is we are just on the cusp of having a democratic debate, and it does need to be something that we have with a wide swath of the country. And I think it's a little unfortunate we're four white men talking about this, but it does need to be something that is really democratized. One of the things Jonathan and I have spoken about is this issue of conflict of interests with these debate. And I think you had a little altercation yesterday where you were on a panel with someone who is on the board of a Chinese state-run investment arm. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to figure out as I navigate this is what is how do people's views change, or how do they change what they say publicly when they have particular affiliations or when they have particular financial relationships with either Chinese state-run firms or Chinese companies? So right now, it is not considered untoward for major academics and major thinkers on this subject to be on boards that are run by the party. And I'm wondering, Bob, what do you think on that issue? And how do you, in Kissinger Associates, do you guys, is there a line for a company that you won't work with because they're Chinese state-owned, or how do you figure that out?
We don't work for governments.
Including Chinese SOEs or sovereign wealth
We
funds?
haven't really been ever approached by a Chinese SOE to do that, so I can't. It's
Kissinger was on the board of a few SOEs, not anymore, but he was. But that might have been his individual, as opposed to Kissinger Associates.
We work with companies that have issues with either other companies or governments. So we're not, we don't play both sides of it. We don't advise governments to begin with. So it's an issue that's never really come up with us at all, because that's been the practice essentially from.
But you do advise Chinese companies, right?
Pardon me?
Chinese companies.
No, we don't.
No Chinese companies.
We don't advise Chinese companies.
Okay.
We advise. It's not that we don't work with with American companies that have interactions with Chinese companies, or we don't advise Chinese companies.
So you don't get paid by Chinese companies is a way to think about it. Okay.
So there was a case recently, and I apologize, I'm not going to remember who it was, but it was some American scholar who was writing or saying something that the Chinese Communist Party didn't approve of, and so they basically said, we're taking away your visa. And there were crickets in response by other China scholars in the US. And it was very disturbing. And I tweeted about it, and I think what they all should have said was, we're boycotting ever visiting China again unless you return this guy's visa. He's not a crazy person. He's a legitimate China scholar, and he happened to disagree with the Chinese Communist Party views. And to me, it really boils down to one central factor, and that is it's super hard to deal with a monopsony. China is a monopsony in so many areas that they have that power. And the only way to deal with a monopsony is another monopsony. And in other words, that's why I'm so big on Japan and China, Japan and Europe and the US getting together. But I did find that disturbing. And I understand why, if you've got your little visa access, you can go to China and you can do your thing, because it's not my area. I get it, but I also think at ends of the day, it ends up hurting us.
I think the struggle, and are we on time? Great. I think the struggle is, how do we counter pernicious Beijing influence without acting more like Beijing? And I think part of the problems with the unity debate is that I would also push back on the idea that the party is unified, but we don't want to act like China in order to counter China, because that's not playing to American strengths. I mean, I think one of the wonderful things about our universities, and one of the reasons so many of Chinese best and brightest want to come here, is because they're ideologically free and because they have a far higher standard of learning than like Tsinghua or Beida or Fudan or other universities in China. How would you?
I'm just saying, agreeing that you're not going to put up with that sort of censorship is not becoming like the Chinese.
I think and I have spoken publicly many times about the problems with censorship in China, and I fully criticize and abhor when Beijing decides to restrict visas. At the same time, it's far rarer than we think. Part of the Beijing strategy here, and part of what we saw was the NBA, is that they will make very loud public examples, and then people will think, oh gosh, I have to be very, very careful with what I say, and then someone will say, well, actually, I think Hong Kong should have more rights. There'll be no response, and then they'll think to themselves, gosh, China's so much freer than I think, without realizing that really the door that you're not supposed to push on is, oh, I don't think Xi Jinping should rule China. I think there's actually high-level corruption among the leaders' families, or these particular gossips among the leaders, or hey, let's start thinking about whether or not the Communist Party should be in charge and what the future would look like. I think we're just almost out of time, so for concluding remarks, I feel a little bad that we went through an entire tech panel without talking about Huawei at all. So as a wrap-up, if people want to give their thoughts on US policy towards Huawei, or more generally, US tech policy towards Chinese and state-linked companies moving forward, and where we want to be with all of this. Jonathan, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think on one hand, you don't want to sort of give any advantage to a company like Huawei. I mean, whatever we're doing to improve its business capability, its innovation capability, any of that, we want to, I think, put a damper on that without damaging our innovation ecosystem. On the other hand, the question of 5G, I mean, we really need an allied horse in the race, so to speak. I mean, whether, Ericsson or Nokia, I mean, these are good choices, if not an American company. So I think the idea that we still, as all, the scientists and engineers that I know in 5G tell me, I mean, we lead in software, so that aspect of 5G is something where we're incredibly powerful. It's just that we've given away hardware to a certain extent. I think it also reminds us that bringing a certain level of manufacturing back to the United States is going to be incredibly important. I don't know exactly how one does that yet, but with additive manufacturing, with the entire question of Industry 4.0 and IoT, I mean, there is this very broad, industrial revolution that's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. And we want to be sure that we're leading that and that we're not just seeding things because we went out with this global supply chain and handed a whole bunch of fundamental features over to an adversarial superpower. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to take the example of something like Huawei and say, wow, that's one where we just weren't in the game sufficiently, and we're going to have to make sure that doesn't happen twice, in addition to whatever we might like to do to make their lives more exciting.
So this is an area where there's just a vast amount of confusion or utter nonsense, I would have to say. There was a foreign affairs or foreign policy article recently that worried that we're not going to lead in 5G and our naval ships in the South China Sea won't be able to use 5G to run their missiles. You can't run a missile off of 5G because it has to have a wire connected to it. 5G is basically a short little radio that's connected to a wire. And unless the aircraft carriers are towing fiber optic cable from San Diego, So I think the core thing with Huawei is we have to differentiate between the security of the network, which most experts suggest is not secure, and therefore we're not going to have it in our system. It's fine. Versus Huawei itself. And we're confusing those two things. When people say, oh, we should stop exporting American technology inputs to Huawei, that has absolutely nothing to do with the security of our network. If you're going to do it, to me, you do it as a trade strategy, not as a fundamental strategy. I think it's going to be hard to kill Huawei. You can damage them, but I don't see what the strategy is. It seems like it ends up, to Bob's point, hurting both of us. I will say one quick thing, though. One of the things that continues to disturb me, and Bob alluded to this a little bit with Made in China 2025, I worry that we're fighting the last war. The future war is Made in China 2025, and the amount of analysis of what they're doing in each of those sectors is extremely limited. And the amount of what we're doing on our side is extremely limited. So we just wrote a big report on what they're doing in biopharmaceuticals in their Made in China 2025 strategy. And not to brag on it, but it was the only report that I could find that anybody has written that goes in depth, including patents, regulation, funding, the whole 9 yards of what China's doing. We should do that in every single sector and then couple it with our own domestic strategy. If we're going to lead in biopharmaceuticals, here's what we need to do. If we're going to lead in semiconductors, here's what we need to do. And we don't do that because, it's industrial policy or this other kind of nonsense, in my view.
Yeah. I think this makes a lot of sense. And let me add one, internationalize this particular point. And that is people talk about the Silk Road, this port in Sri Lanka, and all these little examples of how the Chinese have leveraged or gotten other countries to leverage themselves. And these physical parts of the Silk Road or the Belt and Road are really very, I wouldn't say inconsequential, because they're obviously very important and very sizable. But the interesting element that we don't focus on, which goes to Rob's last point, and that is the digital Belt and Road. And the digital Belt and Road is not just about digits going back and forth or data going back and forth or wires going back and forth. It is about what the rules of the world's, of the information world are going to be like 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. What about data privacy? What role can governments play? What about encryption? I mean, there are the Chinese idea of data rules, data standards, and American rules about data and data standards and protection of privacy and such things are very different. And ours are different from the Europeans too in many areas. So if we really want to be able to play, we had this notion of a seamless information world 10 years ago. That was the vision, that was the idea, that was the hope. Naive, but that was what it was. Now we're seeing the risk of a balkanization of the international information environment and ecosystem. And I think in the end that, and who sets the rules, the standards, the practices, the norms, is going to play a critical role, not just for our economics and our companies, because if we don't, other companies will have rules that are more conducive to their prosperity. But there are lots of security interests, there are lots of domestic interests that are impacted by this. So we need to have exactly the kind of things, sector by sector, that Rob's talked about, but we also have to figure out that the rules, the old global WTO is not an effective institution in many areas, and there are no 21st century rules for dealing with most of these sectors. So if we're going to do what we do at home, which Rob has suggested quite effectively, we need to have a similar set of policies abroad. We don't have any coherence on the international rules on data or privacy or anything else, but many other areas as well. So we have to, it's a big world and American companies want to play in that world, but if the rules are adverse to them, it's harder for them to do it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.